Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Surprise, I'm not Craig.
Yeah.
So if you were expecting Craig and you want to leave, I guess here's your time. But no, he'd asked me several weeks ago if I'd speak today, and more than happy to do that. You know, it's always a privilege to look at Jehovah's Word and to share it with people. So, and if you don't think that, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. But anyway, as I was looking at our passage today, Leviticus 25, there were a couple of big topics that struck out to me that I thought Jehovah would probably have me talk about. And of course, there are instructions about the land Sabbath and Jubilee. And so, you know, I started looking at those, in particular, you know, the Sabbath and what all that means, and then the Jubilee and all the stuff associated with that, and some lessons from that. And as I got more and more into it, and as I was trying to finalize things for today, I realized that I probably had too much. I don't think any of you want to sit here till 5 o'clock listening to me. So you all listening to, okay, why don't we just, huh?
Game.
Your game?
Yeah.
We'd probably be pretty hungry by then. But anyway, and you know, it was awesome. Nothing official, but I have been kind of keeping count each week of what we have people-wise. And we're usually between 45 and 55, somewhere, you know, just below or just above 50. Counted 79 people today.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And it's funny, I thought, oh man, we're so close to 80. But then I was reminded, we have Baby Crater on the way and Baby Myers on the way. So technically we have 81 souls here today. So, huh? Yes, I did. Yeah, I did. But so anyway, yeah, that's just awesome that we're all here together. And so I hope that as we look at this, that we can enjoy what Jehovah has for us from His Word today. So we're all familiar with the weekly Sabbath, or Shabbat, and the necessity of following Jehovah's commands concerning its observance. But in this chapter, he also introduces the concept of the Sabbath for land. And once Israel gained possession of, you know, what He promised them, they would. So, you know, there's that, and that was something that I think was new, and we'll talk about that. But before we get into that part of it, and again, we're going to look at the Shabbat and a couple of things. One, we'll look at, you know, is it important, and if so, why? And look at some reasons why the Word says that it is an important thing that we need to observe. And then secondly, I think we'll just look at some of the lessons that we can learn from Shabbat and what it's all about. But before we do that, there was one other thing as I started reading and studying the passage that I noted, and so I wanted to share it with you before we got into the others. So call it a bonus lesson or whatever. No extra charge. But if we look at the first couple of verses there in Leviticus 25, it says there, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord." And, you know, as I thought about that, first of all, I was struck by the fact that Jehovah is talking to Moses here at Mount Sinai. And as I looked into it, we're about 3 months removed from Israel exiting, or the Exodus and leaving Egypt. So here we are, not even 3 months, and Jehovah is already talking about, and that's really, you know, the other thing, is in verse 2 when he says, when you come into the land. He didn't say if, or, you know, maybe, or anything like that. He said when. And, you know, so to me that was, you know, just kind of a, wow, that's kind of cool. That, you know, 3 months in, because we know 40 years is going to how long it's going to be before it actually happens. But he's saying when. And so, you know, just two thoughts there real quick. The first was the fact that nothing catches Jehovah by surprise, does it? As some of you know, and my wife's been keeping me updated, but I've been working on building a fellowship hall / enclosing a back porch on the back of our house. I'll be honest with you, just about every part of that project, there's been challenges. And Jake and Zach and Zeke all know from being builders, and probably others too, that you never have a project that just goes the way that it's supposed to. You always run into things that catch you by surprise or you weren't expecting. Just this last week, Josh and I, we've been hanging the drywall, and you know, that's cool. But I believe it was last Sunday when we started getting a bunch of rain, developed a leak that hadn't had before. And of course, you don't want to hang drywall when you've got water coming in. So we got to looking into it and saw that there was water running down the wall from up above. And what used to be the outside wall of the house was now the inside room of this, or inside wall of this room. And thankfully, we hadn't hung any drywall yet in that portion where the leak was. So thank Jehovah for that. But still, we had to figure out what was going on, because you know, you don't want to hang up drywall and have it get wet and get ruined. So anyway, discovered that when they had put the soffit on the upper part of the second story roof, they had slanted it toward the house. So whenever it would rain, there'd be water that would drip in there, and it would run down the soffit and down the wall. Wasn't a problem when that was an exterior wall. I mean, you know, it'd run behind the siding or whatever, and it was fine, but definitely a problem. So I ended up having to rip all of the soffit and everything off of there, and going to have to redo it. So it slants away from the house and not toward it. But anyway, you know, again, that's just something that happened. But, you know, back to what we were talking about here, something like that or nothing like that catches Jehovah by surprise. He knows, and so, and then secondly, the fact that he exists outside of time. You know, and that's something, you ever want to drive yourself crazy? Try to wrap your head around eternity.
Yeah.
And the fact that God has always been and will always be. It's just not something that our feeble human minds can even begin to understand. It'll make us crazy if we try to. But, you know, Jehovah exists outside of time. And whether it's 40 days or 40 or 400 or 4,000 years, it's all the same to him. And so he can make, you know, he can tell Moses when, because to him it's already happened. And so we can, you know, count on him and trust him because he knows. But again, just a couple of little thoughts there. But back to the topic at hand today, and that's about the Sabbath. And like I said, I want to look at two things in particular today. I want to look at why is the Sabbath important? What does Scripture say about that? And then secondly, we'll look at some lessons we can learn from Shabbat. But how do we know that Sabbath is important to Jehovah? And I got, I think, 6 different things that we'll look at. So the first one is, when was Shabbat or the Sabbath first initiated, or when was it first discussed?
Back in Genesis.
Back in Genesis. Genesis chapter 2. If you want, we can turn there for a minute and read what he does. But yeah, absolutely. We'll just read the first 3 verses. It says, "Thus the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Now on the 7th day Jehovah ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And Jehovah blessed the 7th day, and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which he created and made." You know, a couple of things. One, a lot of you probably watched the Way documentary, and Tam and I watched it together several months ago for the first time. And there's a gentleman on there that's speaking, and he talks about realizing or recognizing that he was a victim of institutional religion. And I think so many of us, are victims of that. We have a way of thinking. And, the Sabbath is no different. We're taught that, throughout our lives and by the institutions that we're a part of, that it shifted from Saturday to Sunday. And we kind of took that as for what it was worth and believed that, again, that institutional religion mindset. But to me, one of the strongest arguments there is for a Saturday Sabbath is right here in creation. And again, I don't know if you've watched it, but several months ago, I watched a debate between Jim Staley of Passion for Truth and a Sunday pastor minister who they debated on this topic, okay? And one of the things that Staley brought up in his initial part of the argument and presentation was the fact that Jehovah instituted the Sabbath at creation. And nowhere in Scripture does he take that away. And he even says at the end, that the gentleman never addressed that topic. And to me, again, it's one of the strongest arguments for this, that he instituted it here. This was before Israel, before anything else. He instituted it. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but, he reiterates the importance of it, obviously. But he instituted it here. And so, again, that was pre-Israel. So you can't say that it's a Jewish thing, because he instituted it here in chapter 2 of Genesis. So we've got that, and then next we've also got what he says in Exodus chapter 20. And we can turn there and we'll read a few verses there. In particular, we'll read verses 8 through 11 of Exodus 20, where he's given the Ten Commandments. Exodus 20, starting in verse 8. But he says there about the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of Jehovah thy Elohim. In it thou shalt do no work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days Jehovah made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And so as this fourth commandment, he's reiterating to Moses and to the Israelites about its importance and keeping its importance. And it needed to be done. Again, he refers back to creation, that he instituted it there. But then he also, there's three terms there that stood out to me at the end of that, I believe in verse 11, where he talks about that, he calls it what? Holy? Again, set apart, yeah, absolutely. Blessed and hallowed, which is the same Hebrew word as holy. But he talks about in creation, but even here he talks about the fact that it's holy or set apart and blessed. And so, reiterating to his people the importance of keeping it. And then one of the other things that I thought about as I contemplated on why the Sabbath is so important is I thought about his feasts. And we'll turn back a couple of chapters from our passage for today to Leviticus 23. And we'll read there about the feasts and some of the verses and what he says there, because not only did he, and he talks about that in here in Leviticus 23 about the weekly Shabbat, but he also adds other Sabbaths or Shabbats as part of his feasts. And that's what I wanted to kind of zero in on there. So first of all, verses 2 through 8, says, speaking to the children of Israel, saying to them concerning the feast of Jehovah, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, Even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, the holy convocation. You should do no work therein. It is Sabbath of Jehovah in all your dwellings. And then verse 4, these are the feasts of Jehovah, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. On the 14th day of the first month, at even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day, the same month, is the feast of unleavened bread unto Jehovah. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein, but you shall make an offering made by fire unto the Lord. 7 days. And the 7th day is the holy convocation. You shall do no servile work there. So, how many Sabbaths we got here for the week of unleavened bread? 2. First day and the 7th day, right? Okay. And then skipping down to verse 15 and reading through verse 21, he says, you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheep for the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. You shall offer a new meat offering unto Jehovah. You shall bring out of the habitation 2 wave loaves of 2 tenths deals. It shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. These are the first fruits unto Jehovah. You shall offer with the bread 7 lambs without blemish of the first year, and 1 young bullock and 2 rams. And they shall be for a burnt offering unto Jehovah, with their meat offering and with their drink offering, even an offering made by fire, a sweet savor unto Jehovah. Then you shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats for a sin offering, and 2 lambs of the first year for a sacrifice of peace offering. And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering before Jehovah. With the 2 lambs they shall be holy to Jehovah for the priest. And you shall proclaim on the self-same day that it may be a holy convocation unto you. You shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. So here we have Shavuot, which we'll be celebrating on June 8th this year. And again, we have it declared as another holy convocation or Sabbath. So we keep the count, we're up to 3. And then skipping on down to verses 24 and 25, he says, speaking to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial, a blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein, but you shall make an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. So, Feast of Trumpets, we're at 4. And then verses 27 through 32, he says, and also on the 10th day of the 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation unto you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. You shall do no work in the same day, for it is the day of atonement, to make an atonement for you before Jehovah your Elohim. For whatsoever soul it shall be that shall not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. And whatsoever soul it be that doeth any work in that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest. You shall afflict your soul on the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even. You shall celebrate your Sabbath. So we're up to 5, right? So far, okay. And then finally, down in verses 34 through 36, it says, and the Lord speaking to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto Jehovah. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. On the 8th day shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servile work therein. So we're at 5, and then we got how many more here? 2 more, right? So we're up to 7. 7 extra Sabbaths that are declared by Jehovah in addition to the weekly Sabbath, just as part of this feast. So again, to me, just something else that is stressing the importance that Jehovah has in keeping the Sabbath. And then, as we've talked about a little bit, and as this week's Torah portion discusses, he introduces a concept here called the land Sabbath. And, you know, as I thought about it and looked, I don't remember that this concept has ever been discussed anywhere in Scripture up to this point. And you know, as I thought about that, I thought, you know, it's funny if you look at, and what's a land Sabbath? Sorry, I guess we should probably ask that, but it's a rest for the land, right? It says don't plant anything, just let whatever grows, and let it rest. Modern farmers, they call it letting the land be fallow.
There you go.
Okay, and there certainly is the principle for that, but up to this point it hasn't been discussed anywhere, so it's kind of a new concept. But I thought about it, I thought back to the fact that there are a bunch of famines mentioned, and I thought about Abraham and Isaac and stuff, and how many famines does it mention in Abraham and Sarah's life? There's at least 2 that I know of, because remember both of them, that they left, and both occasions, Abraham's like, she's my sister.
Yeah.
But, and like father, like son, the same thing happened with Isaac and Rebekah, and they do the same thing. But still, it talks about a famine. And it made me wonder if, because, again, as you look at the whole idea of the land Sabbath, there is a lot of scientific proof for the benefits that gives to the land. And so, I think, again, it's just speculation because it doesn't say, but you just wonder if some of those same poor farming techniques that have plagued farmers throughout the years weren't happening back then to cause those famines in the first place. I don't think any of us were around for the 30s and the Dust Bowl era, but we've all heard of it. And that was a pretty amazing time in our country. And as I was looking into that, April 14th, 1935, so they call it the Dust Bowl era because it was mainly in the 30s, and again, we know that was also the time of the Depression, but in particular on April 14th, 1935, there was a dust storm that was so intense that it caused total darkness for between 15 and 30 minutes in some places. Just they had so much dust and dirt in the air that it just was like pitch black night. And it caused numerous livestock deaths just from suffocation from the dirt blowing around in the air. I even read where it caused some buildings to collapse from the weight of the extra dirt that was thrown on them from it. But its result was widespread crop failure, and a lot of farmers lost their farms. It's estimated that, and this was amazing to me, that upwards of 1.2 million tons of topsoil across 100 million acres were lost during the Midwest, or in the Midwest area where this happened. It even talked about some of this dirt ended up as far east as Washington, D.C., New York. And there's even documentation of ships that were out in the Atlantic who had dust from these dust storms that settled on them. I mean, I didn't look at how many miles that was, but probably close to 1,000 anyway. So just pretty crazy. But again, it's the result of poor farming techniques that, which again had, and again, this whole concept of allowing land to be fallow, or the land Sabbath, is something that I think is something that Jehovah initiated here. And there are a lot of good scientific reasons for Jehovah asking us to do things. And, I think this is another example of that, where if we just trust him. But the crazy thing is, and we'll look at that a little more, but think about what happened how many years did Israel spend in exile? 70, yeah. And what did Jehovah tell Jeremiah about where that 70 came from? Anybody remember? He talks about the fact that the Israelites never observed the Sabbath of rest for the land. So for 490 years, they basically ignored this principle that Jehovah gave them. And as a result, it's like, okay, I'm going to let my land rest for 70 years because you never did. But just again, I think another principle that shows how important observing Shabbat or the Sabbath is. And then the fifth thing is the fact that Yeshua himself, while he was on the earth, always observed the Shabbat. I just wanted to look at a couple passages that talk about that, because this isn't something that he just did once in a while, but did pretty regularly. We'll kind of work our way through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But let's start in Matthew chapter 12, if you would. Turn there with me. And we'll read the first 14 verses there. It says, at that time, Yeshua went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were in hunger and began to pluck the ears of corn and eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. But he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of Jehovah, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests? Or have ye not read in the law, how on that Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. And if ye had known what it thus meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue. So again, it's on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a man which had a hand withered, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him? And he said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will they not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. So again, here's just an example of Jehovah that, first they're going, and it says he ends up in the synagogue. So, he went there. And then over in the book of Mark, chapter 1, and we'll read verse 21 there. It says, they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. And over in chapter 2, it says there in verses 27 and 28 of Mark chapter 2. And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Again, talking about its importance. And then in chapter 3, again, just right next door, verses 2 through 4, it says, and they watched him whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man which had the withered hand, stand forth. And he said to them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day, or do evil, to save or life, or to kill? But they held their peace. And then skipping over to the book of Luke, starting first of all in chapter 4, we'll read verse 16 there.
Which?
Luke 4:16. It says, he had come to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And then farther on in Luke in chapter 13, verses 10 through 16. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. Behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself. And when Yeshua saw her, he called her to him, and said unto her, woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she made straight, and glorified Jehovah. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Yeshua had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. The Lord then answered him and said, thou hypocrite, Doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall, and lead him away to watering? And not doth this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? So again, it talked about him being in the synagogue, and he healed this woman. So, again, the creator of the universe thought that Shabbat was important enough that he went there on a regular basis. And then, lastly, thing I want to look at that emphasizes the importance of Shabbat is just looking at some of the penalties that Jehovah gave for not keeping it. What's the penalty in the law for not keeping the Sabbath? Death, right? Yeah, there's even an incident mentioned about a man who was out gathering sticks on the Sabbath day, and Moses said to Jehovah, "What do we do?" And he's like, "Stone him." And I thought about that fact. I mean, pretty severe, isn't it? Think about it. I mean, some stoning offenses make sense. You kill somebody, commit adultery, those are cut off for stoning offenses. But not keeping the Sabbath, just again, it's emphasis of why Jehovah thinks it's important. Just looking at that, and even as we discussed a few minutes ago, the fact that the Israelites refused to keep the land Sabbath that he instituted here in Leviticus 25, and ultimately led them in exile for 70 years because they refused to do that for the 70 times that it should have happened. So what lessons can we learn from about the Sabbath? We've looked at several reasons why it's important, but why did Jehovah institute it? What things can we learn?
We need to rest.
We need to rest, absolutely, Amber. We all know that Jehovah, it talks about he rested from the work that he did. But did he need to rest because he was tired?
No.
Absolutely not. And we all recognize that. So, if he didn't need to rest, then what's he really trying to teach us in instituting it and giving it to us? And I think one of the first things that we can look at and get our hands around is the fact that it's a gift. And as I thought about that fact, because it is a gift, and I think part of it is our Creator knows us. I'm going to get personal here for a minute. Most of you probably know, but regardless, I learned a long time ago there's two types of people. There are task-oriented people, and there's people-oriented people. I'm a task-oriented person. Give me something to do, and I'm all over it. Now, have me go up and meet somebody I don't know, that's way more of a stretch for me. But anyway, so, like I said, I'm very task-oriented and driven and love to keep busy. And back in my younger days, one of the other things that, if you know me, you know about me, is that I love numbers. So I started doing some figuring in my head because, so they say we should sleep 7-8 hours a day. So that leaves 16 hours in a day that we can work. Okay, that's probably where I'll write some of the math up here. So if we just count the 6 days that we're supposed to work, that gives us 96 hours in a week that we got to do stuff, right? Okay? So I thought, if I could train my body and learn to get by on 5 hours of sleep a night instead of 8, what's that going to do for me? So, okay. Might be tired, sure. But anyway, so 5 times 7 is 35 hours of sleep a week. Okay? Now, how many hours are there in a week? 128? Is that right? 168.
168.
Yeah. So there's 168 hours in a week. And if you sleep 35, that leaves you 133. You divide that by 6. Well, you can see, gives you way more. I mean, if you discount the 16 hours for Shabbat, so you got to take that out. So that still leaves 117. Gives you an extra, 21 hours a week. So anyway, that was my thought on how I could add another day to my week. Instead of having a 7-day week, I could have an 8-day week, okay? That isn't really what Jehovah wants from us, is it? He doesn't want us to be more busy. I think in giving us the Shabbat, that he wants to emphasize to us and give us that gift that, hey, you need to come aside, you need to rest, you need to give your body. And not just you, but it talks about your servants and even your animals. They need to rest too. They shouldn't be working all the time. That's not good for you. So, you know, it's time to not hurry or check off something else on our to-do list, but instead it's a day to simply be and enjoy time with our family and with other believers and worshiping and just spending an extra time in His Word even. So that's one thing that I think we can learn from Shabbat, is the fact that we need to rest, and He gives us that gift to do that. And secondly, I think it's about stopping. What do I mean by stopping? Any ideas? What's the mean do you use?
Do you mean be still, that I am?
Absolutely. You know, because that's what what popped in my head as I thought about this whole principle of stopping, is taking the time to meditate on Scripture. Not just look at it as another task that's got to be done. You know, okay, I read my 3 or 4 or 6 chapters or whatever for today. But to actually stop and to meditate. You know, we've all been there. Josh and I jokingly will talk as we're working on the build about how our minds will kind of work it, and we end up somewhere that we didn't ever think that we'd end up. You know, you look back on that, how did I get there from here? But you know, if you let your mind kind of just relax and stop and meditate, I think Jehovah can speak to you in ways that being busy and constantly doing stuff that He can't. So, you know, again, that whole principle of just setting aside some special time and stopping and meditating and allowing Scripture and Jehovah's Spirit to talk to you and teach you things. You know, I also thought in this whole idea, sister there mentioned meditating, and there were several scriptures. We can probably quote most of them. Joshua 1:8. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate on it day and night. And in Psalm 1 was another one that come to mind, the first couple of verses. Blessed is the man who walketh not in ungodly, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, nor standeth in the way of sinners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in this law doth he meditate day and night. So again, just that whole principle, you know, Scripture even talks about it, and there's several others too, but we won't, for sake of time, go there, but about just the benefit of meditating and stopping and allowing God's Word to permeate our thoughts. And then thirdly, I thought about the fact of, we talked about it, how Jehovah, in giving that 4th commandment, talks about it's hallowed or holy or sacred. And, you know, Jehovah there in giving that commandment What's the first word in the commandment? Remember. Remember the Sabbath. And you know, again, I've thought of how easy it is for us to get so busy with life that we stop to remember what it is that Jehovah really wants us to do. And, you know, again, if we have to be reminded to remember something, it's probably not something that we do naturally. It's something that we're going to have to teach ourselves. But, you know, it's a special day that need to be treated as such. Because, again, I thought of the passage in 1 Peter 2:9. Guess we can turn there real quick. What Peter says there.
What is it?
1 Peter 2:9. Sorry. It says, but you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So, you know, just the fact that here Peter reminds us that we are a set apart holy people, and we ought to conduct our lives and be able to treat Shabbat as a holy special day, because we're a holy special people. And again, we're God's people. And so we should treat Shabbat as such, just as honoring to him for giving that to us. And the last thing that I thought of, and to me, this is kind of, I think, at the crux of the whole issue of Shabbat and celebrating the Sabbath. And that's the issue of trust. Okay? Because a couple things come to mind. First, you remember Israelites are in the wilderness and they're complaining to Moses, we're all going to die, we're all going to starve to death. And Jehovah gives them manna to take care of them. But how many days did they have to gather in that manna? 6. On the 6th day, they're supposed to gather twice as much. Okay? And, you know, it talked about those who gathered too much during the week or during the first 5 days. They get up in the morning and it was rotten and nasty. But on that 7th day, no. So, you know, I'm sure because there's a lot of us probably would do it too. There were people who didn't gather enough on the 6th day. And they were either going to their neighbors, hey, I don't have anything, or like, you know, he gave examples of those who did just the opposite and gathered too much on the days they shouldn't. But again, it's back to that issue of trust. You know, Jehovah was teaching his people then. Do you trust me to do what I ask you to? And, you know, he did show them that they could do that, but we have to be willing to put that trust in him. So that was one example. And the other one was in our passage today about allowing the land to be fallow for every 7th year. And during the Jubilee, you know, it was 2 years in a row. But he talks about the fact that, you know, I will make the land produce enough to take care of you. But did they ever do that? Again, as we talked about, they didn't. And as a result, they were exiled for the 70 years because they refused to trust him enough to not do it and allow him to bless them so that they could get through what otherwise, you know, wouldn't be. So there is that whole issue of trust. And, you know, again, I think that's part of what he's trying to get people to understand here and giving to us is, do you trust me? And, you know, even if you look at Genesis and the fall, what was at the crux of Satan's argument to man, to Eve and to Adam there in the garden? Because God had given them the garden and said, all these trees you can eat of, just don't touch this one. But again, Satan put in that little bit of doubt. Can you really trust him? Is he really going to do what he says? And so, you know, again, we need to think about it. Do we trust Jehovah enough to do what he asks us to? Craig mentioned something last week that just to me was so profound and so true. And that's that issue of obedience and trust, because the two go hand in hand, don't they? But you know, I mean, we've looked at, there are scientific reasons why we shouldn't do certain things that Jehovah tells us not to do. I think his example last week was about eating pork. And yes, there are, again, scientific reasons why eating pork meat is not healthy. But the point he made is, you know, we should do it because Jehovah asked us not to do it. Not because it's good for us, you know. And there isn't one of us as parents who haven't said to one of our children when they're, why do I have to do that? And what's our standard response? Because I said so. Absolutely. And you know, Jehovah is, I think, the same way. We should be willing to do it because he said so. Because after all, you know, we're imperfect parents, but he's the perfect father. And he loves us unconditionally, even when we're unlovable. But do we trust him enough to do what he says and to obey him just because he says so? And again, I think looking at Shabbat and what it's all about is certainly another reiteration of that. So, Shabbat Shalom.
Right.